Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to talk about ka'ikar. The flavor of a food item is equivalent to its substance, meaning if flavor of an item can be tasted in a mixture, it is as though the item itself is sitting right there in the mixture. When does this matter? Well, think about it. If somebody is preparing a chicken soup and accidentally a little bit of milk falls in, well, we have a little bit of a problem here because you have a drop of milk in this fleishig soup. Don't you have basar b'chalav? Don't you have milchigs and fleishigs together? And what we basically say is, if you can taste the ta'am of the milk, if you can taste the flavor of the milk, then the ta'arovet, the mixture, is a problem even after the fact. But if you cannot taste the flavor of the milk, then the ta'arovet, the mixture, after the fact, again, we don't do this lechatchila on purpose, but after the fact, it is considered kosher. That is because ta'am ka'ikar, because the flavor is as though the substance itself is there. What we generally do is instead of tasting it, because we're not supposed to, or asking somebody who's not Jewish to taste it and tell us, can you taste the milk in here? What we do is we use a ratio of 60-1. If there's a ratio of 60 of the permitted item to 1 of the forbidden item, or in this case, 60 of the meat soup to 1 of the drop of milk, and as long as you can't still see it, we say b'diavad, after the fact, it is kosher, right? So we want to make sure that there's no time. This comes up in Masechet Avodah Zarah on Samach Zayin Amud Aleph and Samach Zayin Amud Bet, because Rabbi Yochanan says something very interesting. He says, if you eat a ta'arovet, a mixture, where there is only ta'am, there is only the flavor of something that is prohibited in it, velo mamasho, but the item itself is not there or discernible, meaning it's dissolved into the mixture. Asur, that is still prohibited, ve'en lo kanav, but you don't get malkot, you don't get lashes. Now, people, when you hear something is asur, something's forbidden, but you don't get lashes, ding, 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 your what goes off in your mind is you say, oh, it must be only rabbinically forbidden, because if it was biblically forbidden, you would get lashes too. So this tips off a whole conversation about whether this idea of tam ka'ikar, whether this idea of we actually count the flavor as though it's the thing itself, is a biblical law or a rabbinic law. Now, one difference between the two would be obviously if you get malkot or not, if you get lashes or not. If it's a biblical law, you get lashes. If it's a rabbinic law, you don't. Now, on the other hand, they did give something called makat mardut, which is like rebel lashes. So maybe in those cases, even if it's Rabbanan, they would do it, but you don't get malkot. But perhaps more to the point, it's if you have a suffix, if you have I'm not sure whether there's a 60-1 ratio. I'm not sure whether the ta'am can be tasted in here. If this is a biblical concept, ta'am ka'ikar, suffix d'oraita l'chumra. If you have a doubt about a biblical law, you always go stricter. So we would say, don't eat it. Whereas if you thought it was, quote unquote, only rabbinic, that ta'am ka'ikar, and biblically, let's say, you just need a majority. You don't need 60-1, right? Then we would say, if you have a suffix, if you're not sure if there's 60-1 here, you can eat it, right? You can err on the side of being lenient, suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula. You can be lenient. So there are nafkaminas, there are consequential differences as to whether you think of it as d'oraita or d'Rabbanan. But what interests me here for us thinking also big about the concept is, well, tell me, if I want to figure out if it's d'oraita or d'Rabbanan, where does it come from, right? Like, does it come from a pasuk? Like, help me understand where this comes from. So this tips us off into a whole conversation as to where is this whole concept from? What does this concept actually bring to our understanding of halakha? So I want to look at the origins of tam ka'ikar. It seems to be in Tanaitic literature, Sifrut Tanait, that the origins of tam ka'ikar come from the isurim, the prohibitions of the Nazir. Take a look, somebody who takes a vow of Nizirut, that they're not going to engage in consuming products made of grape, right? As part of what they do, look at the way the psukim The verses explain it in Bamidbar Perek Vav. Vayidaber Shema Moshe Lemor. God speaks to Moshe saying, spoke to Moshe saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. Va'amarta alehem, and say to them, Ish o isha ki yafli neder. Lindor neder nazir lahazir laHashem. If there's anyone, man or woman, who chooses to articulate a vow of nizirut to God, look at the things they can't partake of in terms of grape products. Miyayin v'shechar yazir. They have to abstain from wine or anything else that's alcoholic, right? Chometz yayin v'chometz shechar lo yishteh. They can't even drink the vinegar that's made from wine or the vinegar of something else alcoholic. And then beyond that, v'chol mishrat anavim lo yishteh. And they can't drink anything in which, and this mishrat anavim is very important, in which grapes have been steeped, shruyim. They've been steeped. They can't drink that either, right? So think like sometimes you go to a spa and they give you fruit infused water, right? We don't want grape infused water for the nazir or for the nizirah. And moreover, anavim lachim v'yivishim lo yochal. And they shouldn't be eating grapes, whether they are fresh grapes or they are dried grapes, which we would call raisins, right? So the Tanaim get a look at this and say, one of these things is not like the other. What is this mishrat anavim? Something that's been, grapes have been steeped in it. So the Sifrei, Midrash Halakha, says, V'chol mishrat anavim lo yishteh, and no drinking. That Nazir or Nizirah cannot drink any, water that has had grapes steeped in it. What has the pasuk left out? Harei kvar ne'amar. It already said, Mi yayin v'shechar yazir. Chometz yayin v'chometz shechar lo yishteh. It said all the liquid versions. You can't have the wine. You can't have the alcohol. You can't any other alcohol. You can't have the vinegar of the wine. You can't have the vinegar of the alcohol. It already said all the possibilities of what liquids they can't drink. So what does it mean you can't drink anything that has had grapes steeped in it? Are we now talking about the vinegar or the wine itself? It teaches us that if somebody steeped grapes in water, that would be problematic so long as the grapes taste is still tasted in there. And from here, you learn about all prohibited mixtures in the Torah. And certainly, right, we're about to make a kal v'chomer, right? We are about to make a, what do you say, kal v'chomer in English? It'll come back to me. If something that comes out of the vine, she'eni suro isur olam, and it's not something that's forever forbidden. It's forbidden for this person while they're a nazir and nizirah. Ve'eni suro isur anah, and they're not allowed to eat or drink these things, but they are allowed to get benefit. They're allowed to derive economic benefit from them. V'yesh lo heter la'achar isur, and they eventually do become mutter. They eventually do become permitted after the nizirut time is over. If in that case, asabo tam ka'ikar, the Torah, it seems, right? The Torah makes us rule that even the taste, it's as though the substance is there. Even the taste of grape, it's as though the grapes are in there really. Shar isurim shabat Torah, then other prohibitions in the Torah. She'isuram isur olam, where they're isurim, they're prohibitions that apply forever. V'isuram isur hana, and they may even be prohibitions where you're not allowed to derive benefit, right? Think basar b'chalav, right? Think milchigs and fleishigs mixture. Ve'elam heter chayisuram, and they don't become mutter, they don't become permitted after they've been prohibited. Eino din shana sebo tam ka'ikar. Shouldn't we definitely say that in those cases, even the flavor is like the substance is sitting there? Seems like an open shut case. Min HaTorah, right there from a pasuk, and very clear. Now, I want to just say something for a minute, which is, I think it's important to note something a little should stay in our background for a little bit. It's important to note this kind of mixture, think about what you're mixing. You're mixing a grape into water. That is what we would call min b'she'eno mino. One species into another species that's not its own. I call this a diverse mixture. Now, I would say to myself, wait, is this only because it's a diverse mixture? And I'll say what I mean by that. Because in a diverse mixture, right, if I were mixing grapes with grapes and just some of the grapes were usher and some of the grapes were mutter, that would be min bimino, right? That would be the same, a non-diverse mixture. It would be the same species. How could you even talk about something imparting taste? They have the same taste, right? It doesn't make sense. So is this specifically because it's min b'she'eno mino, because it's water and grape, where there actually is something to taste? Or would this be the same if you had a situation of min b'mino, where it's literally the same thing? It's just one of them is usher and one of them is mutter. So we don't know. But suffice it to say, that already comes up in my head. Now, I will say there is a Tosefta in Masechet Trumot that actually does offer the opinion that at least when it comes to non-truma situations and non-yayin nesach situations, and also maybe a particular kachim situation, but we're not going to talk about that, that we say kol shar kol yisurim, all other prohibited things, bein biminan, bein shalo biminan, benotein tam. Whether it's the same item, it's just one is usher and one is mutter, or it's a diverse mixture where these are actually different items that are mixed together. They don't have the same taste. Either way, notein tam, whether the flavor could be imparted is the standard, right? That's very interesting. Now, why would I say the standard for where they're the exact same? If the flavor could be imparted is the standard. There's no new flavor to be imparted. Well, it would have to be, you'd quantify it. You'd say, well, if this were a diverse mixture, would the flavor be imparted? Right? That's how we come up with our 60-1. Now, what would be our other option if we wanted to make a distinction between min bimino, a non-diverse mixture, I'm going to say grapes and grapes, not for a nazir, but for something else, grapes and grapes, and min b'she'eno mino, where you have a diverse mixture. So diverse mixture, I get it. You want tam ka'ikar, you want the taste to be the essence, and that's going to be the standard. Fine. But min b'mino, what would the standard be? Well, quite frankly, you might argue the standard would just be rov, be majority. So we have a pasuk, acharei rabim latot. You follow the majority. Meaning, so is it possible that you might have two different standards, even though this Tosefta is saying, no, it's the same standard, right? Notein tam, 60-1, same standard, right? And I'm using those interchangeably, even though we can talk about whether they're interchangeable always. But so now already, I just want you to have in your head, we have questions about tam ka'ikar. Is tam ka'ikar deoraita or derabanan? We also have a question of, is tam ka'ikar the basis for min b'she'eno mino only, a diverse mixture only, or is it also for min b'mino, right? Okay. Now, by the way, halachically, the answer is yes, but fine. I also want to look at one more example from Tanaitic literature, Sifru Tanait, where things, tam ka'ikar seems like it's across the board and it seems like it's doraita, but that's also a measure of how much the Chazal talk in Tanaitic literature about the difference between the Rabbanan and the Oraita, right? So it might be related to that. But here is like instead of a chumrah, instead of the strict piece, I have a kula for you. Because take a look at this. The Mishnah in Chala says, Ha'oseh isa min achitim u'min ha'ores. Let's say, now you're going to have to be Sephardi for this. Let's say somebody makes dough made of wheat and of rice. Im yesh b'atam dagan, if you have the taste of the grain in there, and the grain being chita, right? The grain being wheat, chayevet b'chala, you have to take chala from it. But here's the best part. V'yotzei ba'adam yedei chovato b'pesach. And you can fulfill your obligation of eating matzah using that. Im ein batam dagan, but if it doesn't have the taste of the wheat, ein chayevet b'chala, you don't have to give chala. V'ein adam yotzei ba'yedei chovato b'pesach. and a person doesn't have to, cannot use it for matzah. Wow, 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 wow. The Tosefta and Challah seems to do something a little bit different, and I included it for you here. But this is amazing because this is a use of tam ka'ikar. The taste is like the substance itself. To say that you could eat it as matzah because you have the taste of wheat affecting it, even if most of the stuff in the dough is rice flour, right? Like, whoa, 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 right? Really, really interesting. So going in the other direction. But when we get to Sifrut HaMora'it, when we get to the Gemaras, things start getting a little more confusing. In fact, instead of this being this very clear, we're getting it from the word mishrat, that we're steeping, that even if grapes were steeped into water, that would be a problem for a Nazir, right? And we're going to learn from that the Holy Surin Shabbat Torah, right? Instead of that, the Gemara offers no fewer than 5 different mikorot, 5 different sources where ta'am ki'ikar might come from. And then you're getting into a problem of the lady doth protest too much. And for each one of them, it kind of figures out why it might not be a suitable limud. It might not be a suitable extrapolation. So the Gemara in Psachim on Mem Dalet on 44a starts with Mishrat as its anchor and says it must be from Nazir, from Mishrat. And then the Gemara ends up saying, and I just dotted it. Everybody, if they want to go back to look at that Gemara, it's beautiful. Like, it's just such an enjoyable and methodical Gemara. Then it says, well, actually, Rabbi Akiva thinks Mishrat teaches you something else. So he can't use Mishrat for that, right? Okay, fine. So where would Rabbi Akiva learn Tam Ki'ikar from? Well, he must learn it from Basar B'Chalav. So that's what I have here labeled as bet. For Rabbi Akiva, Tam Ki'ikar Minele, where does Rabbi Akiva learn Tam Ki'ikar as? Yalif mi Basar B'Chalav. Doesn't he learn it? He must learn it from just the Isser, the prohibition of milk and meat. Lav Tama B'Almahu, V'Asr, isn't just think about what happens when you cook. I guess what we're really talking about is cooking milk and meat together, right? If you cook them together, what's going to happen? The milk is going to dissolve and all you have left is the taste. And isn't that still asur? Hachanami loshna. So here too, it should be the same thing. In the the Gemara says, well, maybe we can't learn from basar b'chalav to everything else because basar b'chalav is a chiddush. It's very innovative. Why is it innovative? Because if I put a cold piece of cheese or if I poured cold milk over a piece of meat, biblically it wouldn't be asur. So that's a very weird thing. It's only if it's derech bishul. It's only if you heated it up. So this is a very strange kind of taro, but it's a very strange kind of it's a very strange kind of example, and so we don't learn from it. It's a chiddush, right? Okay, fine. I want to just point out, just like Mishrat was min b'she'enu mino, Basar b'chalav was also min b'she'enu mino, right? We're talking about meat and milk. These are 2 different things. So we try again. The Gemara says, okay. What about gi'ulei goyim? What about in the war with Midian at the end of the book of Bamidbar? The Jews are told, Bnei Israel are told, when you get the pots and pans from Midian, you know what you have to do? You have to ta'aviru ba'esh. You actually have to, and ta'aviru b'mayim, you actually have to kasher these things. You have to kasher them. And what do we learn from that? This is hag'ala, right? Kashering through boiling and purging with water, or libun, whitening, which is burning, right? That's blowtorch or self-clean oven and all that stuff, right? So the Gemara says, well, elayalef migiyulei goyim, so we should learn from that, because giyulei goyim, what you're going to be purging from those pots, lav tama bi'almahu, aren't we talking about just the ta'am? We're just talking about taste. You're just purging whatever taste is inside the walls of the pot. You're not assuming that there's like meatballs in there, right? After the war with Midian. V'asar, and it's still prohibited. So perfect. Another example, tam ki'ikar, right? Perfect. Another example, tam ki'ikar, right? But then the Gemara says, nah, that's not a good place to learn from it either, because that's also a chiddush. Why is it a chiddush? Because usually we say that if the taste is over a day old, we say that you do not have to worry about it after the fact, because that is notein tam lifgam, right? It gives a flavor that is gross. But in the case of Midian, they even had to worry about that because the assumption was not oh, people must have made things on all of these dishes, in all of these pots and pans within the last 24 hours. Okay, so our three examples that come from the world of chulin, right, that come from the world of mundane food eating, have now each been challenged. Mishrat has been challenged by Rabbi Akiva because he uses it for something else. Basar b'chalav has been challenged because it's too much of a chiddush. Giyulei goyim, purging from the pots and pans after midyan, also challenged because it's too much of a chiddush. Okay, so let's look at kachim. Let's look at the world of kachim. In fact, we have a pasuk that tells us in Vayikra Perek Vav, Vayikra chapter 6, tells us that something that we should know about the korban chatat is kol asher yiga b'vsara yikdash. Anything that touches it becomes kodesh, essentially takes on its status. So it's called the chatat mikadeshet, right? The korban chatat makes things kodesh. Tanya, we learned in a braita, kol asher yiga b'vsara yikdash, anything that touches bivsara in its flesh becomes kodesh. Yachol afilu lo bal'a, you think it means even if it wasn't absorbed? Talmud lomar bivsara, it's in its flesh. Yikdash. Ad sheyi bala bavasar, it's when it has been absorbed into its flesh, meaning it's just the ta'am, right? It's just the ta'am. Even if just the ta'am of the chatat got into something else, it actually impacts that something else. And in fact, the Gemara continues that yikdash, it becomes kodesh liot kamoha, to be just like a korban chatat. She'im psulahi, if it's a sin offering that's disqualified, tipasel, this meat that is just absorbed, part of its taste is going to have the same problem. V'im ksherahid, if it's kosher, teachel kechamur sheba, this meat that now has some absorption of a korban chatat in it has to be eaten like a chatat, right? It doesn't have, let's say, shlamim has lighter responsibilities in terms of how you eat it, where you eat it, right? Chatat has more stringent. Everything is treated like that chatat. Oh, sounds good. Now, one thing I should say is the only thing we're not super comfortable with, and the Gemara is fine with it, actually, so maybe I won't say it yet. The Gemara then rejects this because it says, well, actually, forget about Rabbi Akiva for a second, who was against Mishrat. We now have, if we're learning it from Nazir and we're learning it from Chatat, then maybe we have a different problem, which is Shnei Ktuvim Haba'im Ke'achad. When you have two psukim that teach you the same thing. When we have two psukim that teach us the same thing, we basically say, no, those are trying to teach you exceptions. They're not trying to teach you the rule. If you wanted to learn the rule, you would have one pasuk that teaches you the rule. But if you have two different instances where something shows up, it means those are the exceptions. So if it shows up in Nazir and it shows up in Chatat, it means it only applies to Nazir and it only applies to Chatat. So we reject it. There is one more option, and that option shows up in the Gemara in Chulin. And that option shows up in what's called the Zroa B'Shela, the cooked Zroa, the cooked, I guess I would say, what's the word that I want to say? Like it's the leg, I guess, right? The leg of an aisle. This brings us back to Nazir, but it's not what a Nazir can eat. It's what are the korbanot when a Nazir finishes up, okay? And in that, you have a korban, an ayil, okay? A korban ayil, a ram that is given. And within that, there is a part of that ram that Bamidbar, Perek Vav, describes, V'lakacha kohen et hazroa b'shela. The kohen gets just that leg of the ram, okay? Nobody else can eat that leg other than the kohen. But other people can eat the rest of it. But guess what? The leg is already cooked, which means, what'd you just do? You cooked that leg with the rest of it, and poof, you now have the tom of that leg in the rest of it. So what do you do there? So the Gemara in Chulin says, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says the name of bar Kapara. Kol Yisur Shabbat Torah, every prohibited mixture, Bisamech, it's 60-1. Amar Lefanav Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Rabbi Atal American. He says, are you sure, Rabbi? 60-1? Hachi Amar Rav Asi Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. You know that Rabbi Asi says something in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum Bar Kapara, in the name of Bar Kapara. Kol Yisern Shabbat Torah b'meya. They think it's 100 to 1. And then the Gemara says, and both of them learn it from trying to figure out the way that the Zroa B'Shela was cooked, the way that this leg was cooked. Was it separated? Was it together? What was the ratio of the rest of the animal to this leg, right? Or to the surface area that touches between them? And one came up with 60 to 1, and one came up to 100 to 1 because maybe they disagreed in how it was cooked, or maybe they disagreed in what was cooked. Now, I want to just point something out. This example and the Chatat example, both of them are kachim. Isn't it possible that you would say tam ka'ikar in kachim, but you wouldn't say tam ka'ikar in chulin? Right? I also want to point out they're both min b'mino. They're both the same thing. They're meats, right? They're meats connected with each other and being absorbed into each other. So just to notice the way that Chazal, in total, the different offerings that we have here. We have a whole min b'she'eno mino section, which is basically all the chulin examples. And we have a whole min b'mino section, which is basically the kachim examples. And so now I want to return, with all of this knowledge, I want to return to Rabbi Yochanan's opening gambit, where he said, it is usher, but you don't get malkut. Okay? So to be very simple, run-of-the-mill, Rashi says, I want you to know this is not biblical. He says, Rava, he says, I want you to know that Rava, I can tell you, late tam ka'ikar b'chulin, he does not think that tam ka'ikar, at least min haTorah, right? That tam ka'ikar applies to non-kachim. Kin mefarish va'azil, as he'll continue in that Gemara in Chulin and say, mid'oraita beruba batil, because min haTorah, rove is enough, majority is enough. Ela midrabanan, instead the law of tam ka'ikar in Chulin, in non-kachim, is rabbinic. And that's what we hear Rabbi Yochanan saying in Tractate of Avodah Zarah. Says, if there's just the flavor, not the substance, you don't get malkut for it. It's usher, but you don't get malkut for it, meaning it's only usher midrabanan. Says, well, what about all those limudim? What about all those attempts to learn it from different places in the Gemara in Psachim, and also in our Gemara in Chulin? He says, V'hadi alfinu le b'psachim, when we learn it in Psachim from Nazir, from Mishrat, litain tam ka'ikar, to tell us that it's the flavor is like the substance. It says, Sfira lahu amorai batroi de asmachta be'almahu. The later Amoraim, even though, by the way, when we looked in Sifrut Tanait, it looked like it was min haTorah, and everybody agrees. The later Amoraim think, nah, connecting it to that pasuk, that's not where it comes from. That's just it's like you can hang the rabbinic law on it, right? It's rabbinic, but they want to find a connection to Torah, right? V'lav melafhu dahavulu, v'lav melafhu. It's not a full limud. That's not the source. Dahavulu nazir v'ge'ule of de kochavim, because, by the way, nazir and the situation of the pots and pans after Midyan, those are bektuvim ava'im ke'achad. Those are two different instances that are trying to teach you the same thing, namely tam ka'ikar. And guess what? If you have two different instances trying to teach you the same thing, we say those are exceptions. They're not the rule, right? So therefore, it's quote unquote only d'Rabbanan. Inami, or maybe, as the Gemara said, like we say in that Gemara, and I mentioned it, it was in our dot, that the situation with pots and pans that's too much of a chiddush to learn from it. Umishrat leheter mitzaref le'isar, and mishrat from Nazir was used to learn something else for Rabbi Akiva. So for Rashi, it's very clear. This is a din d'Rabbanan. For the Rashba, not so. The Rashba says, Uveshem Rabbeinu Yitzchak Zal, people say in the name of Rabbeinu Yitzchak, or actually, I'm going to skip to where he quotes the Ravid. He says, Gama Ravid Zal, Kach Katav, this is what the Ravid wrote, Tam Ka'ikar de'oraita, Bimin B'she'eno Mino. You ready? Min haTorah, Tam Ka'ikar applies, where? In a diverse mixture, right? Not everywhere, in a diverse mixture. Min haTorah. V'lo amru chad b'trei batel ela b'min b'mino. We only say that majority is enough to nullify biblically, if it's the same substance mixed in itself, right? But then why doesn't Rabbi Yochanan want you to get malkot in the case of min b'she'enu mino with a tam? He says pamim loke, pamim eno loke. He says sometimes you get malkot for such a mixture and sometimes you don't. It really depends. Ketzad, how? Kizayid b'chdei achilat pras. If there's actually a kizayid of the usser stuff there, and it can be eaten in the amount of time that it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. If you eat a kizayit of the bad stuff, meaning the usser stuff in the mixture, then you have a problem with divrei kol. Everybody agrees that you get milk. Meaning, what the Rashba is trying to say in the name of the Ravid is no. It may be that tam ka'ikar is dirabanan in the case of min bimino, because to be honest, it doesn't really make sense to be talking about tam when you talk about min bimino. Min HaTorah, we follow, majority is enough to nullify. Midirabanan, we say it applies. But min b'she'enu mino, which is taking us back to the original Mishrat, right? You have a liquid and a solid. These are not the same things. Tam kikar is min HaTorah. What are you talking about? So then why would Rabbi Yochanan say you don't get malkot, which is usually an indicator that it's not asur min HaTorah? Because actually, even if it's asur min HaTorah, unless you ate a kizayit of something asur, that's you're not going to get malkot. So if you do have a kizayit of the thing in there, of the usser thing in there, and you do eat it, okay, then you'll get malkot. But if not, you don't. And it kind of makes you realize that what you're looking at is a mixture. The whole mixture has not now become like we treat every part of this mixture as though it's flavored with isser, and you can't get malkot for eating that. You have to get malkot for eating the isser itself, not the ta'arovet. And this is very different, for example, from the Rosh, because the Rosh says, in the name of Rabbeinu Tam, Upirish Rabbeinu Tam, the Tam ka'ikar b'min b'she'eno mino, de'oraita, that Tam ka'ikar, the flavor, is considered the substance. Biblically speaking, the kevan shenatan ha'isser tam beheter, because as soon as that prohibited item has imparted its taste onto the permitted item, nehefach kulo lihiyot isur veloken alav. The whole thing has become a prohibited item, and you do get malkot for it. And what Rabbeinu Tam has to do is figure out how, when Rabbi Yochanan says, if you have tam and not mamash, you don't get malkot, he must not be talking about min b'she'enu mino. So let's just do a quick roundup. We have two types of mixtures. A mixture that is min b'mino, two types of, the same type of grape, but one grape might be from, it hasn't, let's take like an orla situation, and one grape is not, right? One grape is mutter, one grape is asur. That's min b'mino. Then you have min b'she'enu mino, where it's diverse species that are mixed together. You have water and grapes, milk and chicken soup, right? It seems that there are three positions. One position is that both min b'mino and min b'she'enu mino, min HaTorah, having a majority that nullifies the problematic item, is good enough. Midirabanan, you require a 60-to-1 ratio. But min HaTorah, having a majority, is good enough. There's another perspective that says, no. When you're talking about min b'mino, then biblically a majority is enough. And rabbinically, we add this minority, taste stuff, right? Because we want it to be uniform, right? So it's dirabanan. But when it comes to min b'she'eno mino, it's actually biblically forbidden, because that taste turns the whole mixture as though it itself is completely prohibited food, and you even get malkot for it. And then there's a third position that says min b'mino, min HaTorah, majority nullifies. Midirabanan, we require the 60-to-1. When it comes to min b'she'eino mino, then we say it's always usher min haTorah, but it's not that the whole mixture becomes as though it's a piece of pork. It's usher, but you only get malkot if there's enough of the prohibited stuff in there that you end up eating a kizayit of it. That's the difference. And I think all of this is found in all these different conversations about where we get the concept of tam ka'ikar from. Our three examples from Chulin, whether it's the Nazir not drinking steeped water or water that's been steeped with grapes, or it's the example of basar bechalav, or it's the example of gi'ule nachrim, the pots and pans after midyan. All of those are situations of min b'she'eino mino, right? Those are all examples of something that is not the same as something else seeping in. And I don't think that's an accident that all those examples are like that. Whereas the examples from Kachim, which maybe we should learn from Kachim to Chulin, are examples of min be mi no. So across the board, hopefully gives a little more depth to that question of what happens if a little drop of milk falls into the chicken soup. Great learning with you, as always.